Lead balloons.
It's the alchemy of
Unpopular opinions. So,
Whoops, I have somewhere to be. There's actually bourbon in this, so everyone knows.
those things are very complicated and
I don't know that I actually believe what I'm about to say.
spreading lies.
This critical culture that we live in.
Just to try to be an asshole.
Well, hello everyone. Welcome to our podcast, Lead Balloons, the alchemy of unpopular opinions. My name's Joel, and we have a special episode for you guys today. But before we jump into that, how you doing, my buddy Trent?
I'm doing good, man. Summer's in full swing. It's not as hot as Dallas, but still quite warm here in Denver. Had fun watching a Copa America game last night at a bar where there were like 1,000 Colombians.
Whoa!
So it was a cultural experience in Denver, man, that I wasn't anticipating. It was a lot of fun. So things are going well, man.
That's cool. That's cool. Yeah, it is definitely so hot here in Dallas. We aren't like Houston or Phoenix. We're just kind of like the armpits during the summer. Maybe Dallas is like the leg pit. That could be.
It's the leg. It's the exposed calf on the canoe trip that you didn't put sunblock on, and you're going to pay the price for.
Yep,
You know,
yep.
it's still exposed quite a bit. Yeah.
All right, so today we're going to be diving into a critical conversation regarding urban planning. Now, before people check out, this is we hope to keep this interesting and dive into some thoughts that we find fascinating and apply to the daily life, especially here in America. We're talking about cities that feel like they seemingly suck the life out of you. I'm calling it City Sans Souls. There's a little alliteration for you, Trent. What do you think of that?
Man, I'm telling you, you know my orientation, so to speak, but that does something to me. Yeah.
Got a little doodaddies up and down your spine, a little tingle in the nether regions.
Man, that is something. That does some things. Yeah.
City Sans Souls. So now, neither of us, friends, are experts, quote unquote, on this matter, but owning that up front, we also want to say that doesn't necessarily and doesn't for sure disqualify us from this discussion. As I will point out later, sometimes it's those without credentials that bring needed criticism and innovating and changing the philosophies of the supposed experts. So, Trent, tell me about your city experience. What cities have you lived in? What cities have you visited? What are your top two American cities and why?
Okay. Yeah. So I've actually lived a fairly nomadic life. I mean, I've lived in quite a few cities as a child and as an adult. I'll rattle off. I don't know that I want to say all of them, but I've lived in Sioux City, Iowa. Lived in Springfield, Missouri, Colorado Springs, Denver. These are not in chronological order necessarily. Tulsa, Oklahoma,
Sure.
Kansas City, Missouri. I think I said Springfield, Missouri. Los Angeles, and that would probably cover almost all of the American cities that I've lived in. Now, cities I've visited, I worked in Ulsan, South Korea for a year as an English teacher. I've been to multiple cities in South Africa: Johannesburg, Durban, Cape Town, Pretoria. I've been to multiple places in the Caribbean, as well as Guam, as well as Honolulu and Kailua Kona. I've been to Vancouver. I've been to multiple cities in Western Europe as well as Scandinavia. So I've been very, very fortunate to travel to quite a few places. And I know you have too, Joel. I think that's going to make our discussion pretty interesting because we have some reasonable data points, you know. My top two cities in America. It's funny because I was thinking about this when you asked me when you asked me this question. I don't think I can count cities that I've only been in for like 2 days because that's just the honeymoon phase of experiencing a
Sure.
city. I
Yeah.
think it's got to be a place you've spent a week or two in or lived in. My top two cities, places that I have lived in, I'll qualify it that way, would be Los Angeles and Tulsa.
Okay.
Now, I'll say just a little bit about that. Los Angeles is a city that I love more than most places, and I hate more than most places. The traffic drives me crazy. The keep
Sure.
up with the Joneses mentality drives me crazy. The pollution and the litter and all that kind of stuff, the graffiti kind of just annoys the hell out of me. But I'm telling you, I love the entrepreneurial spirit of the people who are there, the people who leave home and say, I'm going to go to Los Angeles and pursue my dreams and see what I do. I love that pioneering, adventuresome spirit that's there with the people. I also love the sunshine. I love the ocean and the hiking that's available pretty low cost in a city that's super expensive, is you can pretty much enjoy those things for just the cost of getting there and parking. And I love also, I mean, I just love being near the water. And the other thing that I loved about LA was there were so many little day trips that you could make sort of within the metro area, as well as maybe an hour outside the city, that were so fun. Little small towns inland, towns on the ocean, towns in the mountains, that you could have so many different experiences within an hour to 2 hour drive. That was there was this endlessly fascinating. The contrast to that is Tulsa, which I wouldn't really recommend to most people or anybody for really visiting there, because it's not like this amazing place. But Tulsa is one of those examples, and of course, you and I both lived there for a long period of time, and you were raised there. But like, I love the unbuttonedness of Tulsa, how it's sort of this. Like, it's got this sort of aging infrastructure, and it's not all well kept, but like the downtown area's got a lot of fun things going on, live music, good restaurants, minor league baseball, and really fun things. It's got really good smaller museums like the Philbrook and the Gilcrease. It has the big river. Arkansas is not necessarily the prettiest running through there, but it is a large body of water. And it's just got those kind of little pleasures that make you work for it a little bit. It's sort of like the cat version of a pet. You have to work for for your pleasure there. You have to work for it. So I like that about Tulsa. I like how there's a mixture. I mean, it is politically, all of Oklahoma is super red, and a lot of Tulsa is super red, but it also has that mixture of the downtown area where you have a lot more sort of like, progressive minded people and that sort of a thing. So I find that Tulsa is a very interesting place. I think the architecture there is fascinating. The history is fascinating. And there's things that are there that you can look for and be pleasantly surprised. So what about you, Big Kahuna?
Well, I mean, in terms of living, I haven't lived near as many places as you have. Obviously, I lived in the Tulsa area, a thriving metropolis of Broken Arrow, which is a suburb, but it's like the third largest city in Oklahoma. I grew up there, lived there until I was 25. Then I lived in Springfield, Missouri for a while. Then I lived in the Philippines, in Baguio City, which is in the northern island of Luzon, for 6 months. And then I, at one point, moved to Dallas, Texas, and I've been here since 2009. Visiting wise, I've been to a lot of places in Southern Europe, the UK, Philippines, multiple places there. Have visited a lot of places in Central America and the Caribbean. I have not been to the continent of Africa, and I've not been to the continent of South America, which are two things I hope to check off my list. But just got back from a trip, spending 2 days in London, 4 days in Ireland. Got to get to know that island pretty well. That was fun. Got to learn to drive on the left side of the road, which was a little scary at first because I was going against all my instincts.
Man.
Oh my gosh! There was one time I was turning out to turn left, right, and when you turn left on their streets, it's like turning right in America. You're hugging that lane. But I'm used to looking left, right, left when I turn. And so that's what I did. Left, right, left. But I'm turning onto this, and I almost I pulled right in front of a car that had to slam on his brakes. And so, At some point in
Mm.
time too, I had to start singing the Cupid Shuffle just to like I can. Anytime I like start making a turn, I'm like to the left, to the left, to the left, because I had to my all my instincts were to go to the right. So that was kind of a fun experience getting to learn that. My two favorite cities. My number one is Chicago. I've never
Mm,
lived there, but I've visited there many times. And what
mm,
I like about Chicago, when I judge a city, I'm looking at like walkability, I'm looking at cultural experiences, I'm looking at urban design. I have a lens for urban design. And this is probably one of two America's great cities in terms of cities that are super old that developed
mm,
before the advent of the car.
mhm,
Um, I know Los Angeles has public transit, but it's other than Chicago, New York City, and Washington D.C. I know other cities kind of have them, but in terms of infrastructure, like when I was
mhm,
in London, I love their underground. It is so
mhm.
efficient, and everyone uses it like New York City, except it's cleaner. and but Chicago, I just enjoy being around. I just love the river that goes through the city,
Mhm.
and just walking around there. I love a city when I can just walk around it. And a city that's smaller than that, one that you lived in that I really appreciate, is Kansas City.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
Kansas City has some interesting public transit solutions that I really like. Union Station, I recently visited there and got to look down there and see all the things that they've done to develop
Mm,
that. It's really
mhm.
fun, and they have just great barbecue, and they have like, things that are kind of unique to Kansas City. So I think it's a city well done. What do you think?
Mm. I agree with that. I think I'd latch on to what you said about unique. I've had this discussion with friends quite a bit when we talk about like travel and cities. Like, as an example, I live in Denver. I like Denver, but I wouldn't tell anybody I love it. And one of the things that I'd say about Denver is I'm not really quite sure how to describe it to people. If I talk
Mm-hmm.
about New Orleans, music, food,
Yeah,
festive, right? Chicago, it's food, it's architecture, it's
yeah,
museums, it's Sears Tower. Like there's things that come to mind.
yeah,
San Francisco is the Golden Gate Bridge.
yeah,
It's Ghirardelli Square. It's
yeah.
the weird street there. The thing, and
Uh,
then they talk about Denver. It's like, well, you could go outside the city to Red Rocks to see a concert, and we can also get you weed before you go up to the mountains. It's like, I'm
yeah.
not. What's the personality of a city? And sometimes I'm not sure how to pin it down on Denver. So
Yeah.
I think cities that have a distinct personality, even if that can be unsavory at times, is something that you'll never forget, and it
Hmm.
makes you want to go there and experience it.
Yeah. Yeah. That it's just more interesting. That's fascinating. So, guys, this is kind of getting into our discussion about this topic of city sans soul. Like, what are these cities that, for reasons that some of us can't even put our finger on, it just feels like they're soulless. And what makes a city soulful? And what is the role of urban planning that helps kind of like make that happen? So, Trent, can you tell us why you care about this topic of urban design, and what about your life makes your perspective worth something to consider?
Yeah. I think why I care about this is I currently live in a big city, and I have always lived, I think, in cities of 150,000 or more. I
Hmm.
think there's so much that cities can offer and do offer, but I think that so much of our human potential remains untapped. We've done great things, but there's so many things that we could do that we shouldn't be content with what we've done. And there's so many
Mm,
sad, terrible things going on in cities that are like, going back to city sans souls, that are soul destroying. I had that
yeah,
experience in LA years ago where I was out looking for an apartment and trying to find one where I could actually afford to have food after I'd paid rent. And I
yeah,
remember driving around city in traffic, kind of in rough areas where there was stuff that I could afford. I'm like, this place is killing my soul. And that prompted me
yeah.
to move to Tulsa. I'm like, I got to get out of here because it's doing something to my soul. So those are reasons why I care about this. And, um, you know, my perspectives were something to consider. I mean, I've traveled widely. I've seen a lot of cities. I have a lot to compare and contrast things. And you and I are both reading about these topics or both watching YouTube videos about these topics. You know, I've had a unique experience living in Denver for the past 6.5 years. So I have done tons of Uber driving. So I've seen so much of the city. And I've also, my work as a handyman takes me all over the city. People who come to the city and they go live in somewhere like the Highlands, which when you came to visit, we were in the Highlands at that Prost Brewing Company. They go downtown, they live in downtown, they live in Cherry Creek, and they don't really branch out necessarily too much. They have a limited experience of what really Denver is. I've seen the entire metro area. And so I've been able to see the city as a whole and feel it as a whole. And I can tell you there are places of the city that are wonderful, that are brimming with life and activity, and there's other parts of the city that are ugly and designed poorly aesthetically. They do damage to the communities that they're in, whether it's highways going through, bisecting certain communities and cutting them off, or just roads that are ugly. And you don't see, dude, I'll tell you this quickly, this story. I love to walk. And I walked home from Denver. I was downtown with a buddy of mine having lunch, and I decided I was going to walk home. Well, it's like an 8-mile walk. And so I had it in my mind that at some point I was either going to take the light rail or I was going to catch an Uber. I ended up walking the whole thing, which, was something. But I remember I walked on 10th Avenue at a certain point. I was probably on 10th Avenue which is 10th Avenue is something like a side street. It's somewhere in between a main thoroughfare and a side street. It gets a pretty good amount of east to west traffic. But it's not so overcrowded. I was on that street for probably about 3 to 4 miles. I don't think I saw a single business on that entire section. And it was ugliness. Like the street was not well maintained. The grass easements were not very meticulously ordered. It was just, and there are a lot of places there weren't even sidewalks. So I'm having to walk on people's yards or whatever to avoid traffic. It was a terrible, terrible experience that I probably won't do again. But that was my experience of walking the city. And it reminded me of how poorly things can be done when you don't care about creating spaces that enhance life and make life good. So,
man, that's powerful. Yeah, I mean, for me, I'm interested in culture. Another way to say that is I'm interested in environments, as you're kind of talking about there, because I think people forget that beliefs aren't formed in a vacuum. People think that they believe what they believe because they're individuals. That's American, but it's no, dude. There are 1,000 factors that are informing what you believe. So for someone to say, I believe, I've chosen my beliefs, I probably could make some very strong arguments. There are a lot of things influence that, and the things that are obvious are things like culture, politics, religion. These things influence us. But I'm going to argue that design, aesthetics, urban planning, they're equally influential because they're passively influencing us in ways that sometimes we don't even recognize. And regarding experience, I sat on a board in the neighborhood where I was a pastor for 12 years and learned a lot about urban planning there, advocated for the neighborhood, was there in the early days of what is now a very gentrified neighborhood, and that has a deep, rich history, and went to city council advocating for trying to bring down a certain highway that separates the neighborhood from downtown. Went to the local transit called DART, Dallas Area Rapid Transit, advocated for they were trying to put a line going through the neighborhood and cut off the neighborhood and basically make it less walkable so that they can have this train. The Dallas Area Rapid Transit, public transit, is terrible. It's not effective for people who live there. It doesn't have enough stops and places. It's really basically designed for people who live in the suburbs to come into downtown, except when they designed it, they didn't realize that actually new suburbs are going to pop up and become just as big as Dallas. So no one goes to downtown anymore. So we have this gigantic, rail that doesn't actually function the way it was designed to function.
Mm.
And when I was on this board that I sat on, which was all property owners in the neighborhood, and we handled public dollars for beautification of the neighborhood and different things like that. One of the property owners gave all of us this book called The Death and Life of American Great Cities by a woman named Jane Jacobs. And we're going to say more about that later. But all of that experience really influenced me. I'm already someone who thinks about space and design naturally. So when I began to like zoom out and see how cities are designed and the infrastructure of that, when we're talking about waterways and how do you get rid of water? How do you bring in water? Traffic and cars and pedestrian life, mixed use of commercial and residential and all retail and restaurants. All these things come together to create an experience that people find either life-giving or life-sucking. And so that's what we're kind of talking about here. So I know I let you know about Jane Jacobs and this book that she wrote in 1961. So a long time ago. For whatever reason, the faith community that I was pastoring had a lot of architects in it, which is really interesting. My ex-wife, she wanted to be an attorney before she became a pastor, and I wanted to be an architect before I became a pastor. And funnily enough, our faith community was filled with attorneys and architects. Those were two very common professions there. But this woman, Jane Jacobs, who wrote this book, what I found out is many of the architects in our faith community loved her to death. These tended to be the kinds of architects that didn't toe the party line. They were the ones who were trying to innovate, trying to do something creative, and they treated Jane Jacobs' book like the Bible for architects. What I love about Jane Jacobs is that she's not a credentialed architect. She's not credentialed in urban planning. Yet she's this journalist who had a very insightful view of cities. And when she wrote this book, it changed literally everything. She coined terms like mixed use, eyes on the street, all these kinds of things that now are unquestioned in urban planning when people are designing cities now. She planted the seed for all of that. And she was uncredentialed. And I have this friend, his wife's a pediatrician. And one time I was hearing him, he was kind of talking about how sometimes people question something about health or whatever. And his response to them is, well, did you go to medical school? Like, as if to say, if you didn't go to medical school, you're not allowed to have an opinion. And it's that kind of gross and small-minded thinking that just kind of goes like, oh, you have to get these credentials in order to have a reliable opinion. And it was Jane Jacobs, the uncredentialed one, the outsider, who called bullshit on the views of the quote unquote philosophies of the experts. And if it wasn't for that, we would have a bunch of dilapidated cities that were trying to develop utopias. And there's all kinds of, you guys can research that, Google her and who she criticized, and you'll find that. So with all of that being said about Jane Jacobs, I sent you some information about this, and she kind of argued that cities are more like living, breathing organisms, and she kind of like was calling people to what we now call people-centered design. Like, if you're going to design a city, what are you designing it for? Don't you want to design it for the people who live there? And so, Trent, sending you these things, I know I gave you a lot to swallow with Jane Jacobs. What are your thoughts on her and her influence?
Yeah, well, so I'm glad you did, because I kind of went on I kind of geeked out for a little while on this. I did some research.
Yeah.
I would have loved to read her book, and she's written multiple books. But okay, so some things I want to say. You are correct that she was not a credentialed architect, but she had spent quite a few years in that space, so to speak. I think she was hired on by a company called it was a magazine, America, I think, called Well, she worked for America, the AMERIKA, but she also worked for Architectural Forum, and I think it was during that assignment that she started doing a lot of research on urban planning. And then she also at some point, I think, received a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation sometime in the 50s before her book came out to do even more research. So she spent a lot of time in that space. And I think one of the things to say is that it is very possible to learn a lot about a subject in a fairly short amount of time. Now, achieving sort of mastery of an instrument, of a sport, of a certain surgical technique might take many, many years, but getting sort of off the ground and in the air for a lot of people doesn't take that long. And then she spent a lot of time looking into these things, and so I think there's that. So some of my things to say about. Actually, I'm going to bring up my notes here.
Yeah.
Something that I think is a lesson from Jane Jacobs is she started critiquing the philosophies of urban planners such as Robert Moses, who was kind of an architect of New York City's infrastructure and buildings and stuff like that. Le Corbusier was another character. I think Louis Mumford was another character that she criticized, who was very, very influential. And she criticized these people who were titanic in their own ways in their contributions, but she was willing to be critical of their ideas. And I think that one of the articles that you sent me is something like Jane Jacobs' critique of rationalist urban planning.
Yeah.
Now, let's say a few things about this, because I think this was a great article, and we could do hours on this. These rationalist urban planners, if I can condense it, and you can help me with this, but a rationalist approach to a problem is one that is guided by rule. It's like a guidebook of rules, procedures, and principles that are sort of ahead of everything else and that are almost unassailable. And if you follow them through, and on their own they make sense. But if you follow them through, then everything's going to be fine. But the problem that Jane Jacobs pointed out in a lot of these approaches was that they would neglect sort of the actual experiences of people living on the streets, things that you wouldn't know unless you had either A, lived in those neighborhoods for a long, long time, or B, had lived imaginatively in those neighborhoods, like I think Jane Jacobs did. Because here's the thing. Jane Jacobs, I think, is probably best described as a middle to upper middle class person. I think she lived, she always had a decent income and didn't have to deal with some of the things that poor people did. That's fine. But that doesn't mean that she doesn't have great ideas about what to do with the slum living conditions. I mean, the people living in the slums. So in order to handle those issues, you need to be on the ground, interfacing with people who are dealing with those issues, and you need to tap into the kind of imagination that comes from reading novels, that comes from having great conversations over a glass of wine for hours into the night with people, where you're able to imagine all that could happen from these set of things. And so like for example, one of the things that she talks about, I know that you'll give examples too, but one of the things I think is wonderful she talks about is these urban planners, let's say in like New York City, they wanted to deal with what were perceived and probably were actually difficult and problematic living conditions in the poorer parts of town, the tenements. So it was proposed that housing projects would go up in the form of high-rise buildings, and the high-rise buildings would be pristine. They would be they would look good, they would be new, and all these kinds of things. And they would then they would also be surrounded by like all these green spaces, which was sort of a suburban value. Was let's sort of replicate country life as much as we can. So we want green spaces, because that makes sense, right? People like green spaces. People need to have green spaces. The unintended consequence that Jane Jacobs pointed out from this was when you had these ugly tenements and ugly poor sections of town, you had these streets that were mixed use streets, and the buildings might have only been 3 or 4 stories high max. And so what you, I think, already mentioned was eyes on the street. So when you have a place like that, when you have all these businesses surrounded that are part of a residential area, and you might also have bars that are open in that area till 3 a.m., there's not a single moment of the day when you don't have eyeballs or ear lobes close to the street to be able to monitor the activity. In fact,
Yep.
she even talks about how it was easier for kids to sort of run around because the mothers might be within visual distance of them, or the neighbors who knew about them, who had a relationship with the parents, could have said, hey, I saw Johnny and he was here with these kids or whatever, or Susie was doing this and blah, blah, blah. So there was this organic connectivity. Then what happened is you had the high-rise buildings, and they were detached from businesses. They were quite a distance from businesses. Then you had the green spaces. What happened was you no longer had eyeballs on the street. And so then you got graffiti, and then you got these places the mom's up on the mom and dad are up on the 30th floor. They don't know where their kids are. There's no connectivity within the neighborhood, to the point where now there was like a study done that showed that like most of the gang activity was happening in these green spaces at night, which were totally removed. Now, a rationalist planner might have missed out on that for either not talking enough with people about the unintended consequences, or not really having a sense of what were the actual strengths of the slums amidst their many weaknesses, and just assuming that everything about them should be raised and started from scratch. It's the kind of limited thinking that happens, just like in the medical community, as you mentioned, when you have all of these specialists who are cordoned off from each other and not willing also to engage with people who are very wise generalists who don't have all of the specialized knowledge, but have the wisdom that comes from lived experience. And I think she cast a spotlight on that in such a profound, articulate way that made a huge difference. And it's very, very fascinating and energizing to learn about that story.
Yeah, I love the fact that she was this woman who didn't even graduate from college, but clearly had very good mental chops. Was a journalist by trade. So most journalists, at least the good ones I've read, are just naturally curious people, and they know how to research something. They know how to connect the dots, and she was able to do that. And she enters this field that is male dominated. She got called all kinds of names, just militant dame, housewife, who is this uncredentialed woman? I wouldn't pay for her book, and all these kinds of things. But her views over time proved to be true. These utopian kinds of high rises built ended up being slums after all these supposed good intentions, but their good intentions detached from reality. I think something you like to say, she did business with the streets. She did business with reality. She was not trying to create a architecture in a vacuum. She was trying to serve the organic nature that's already there. Like, one of the things she always argues is there needs to be old buildings. They can't all be new. There needs to be old ones. Like, there are some places, chain stores, they'll go into the new buildings, or a museum might go into a new building. But like smaller galleries that feed the arts, smaller, restaurants that are ethnic food, they're tend to be in the older buildings. And if you do all new buildings, you get rid of a lot of opportunity that brings diversity. And then you begin to what tends to happen is this tip over into a very bifurcated community. And I love, you mentioned the eyes on the street. She calls that natural surveillance, sort of this surveillance that just happens because there's human beings there. And in her book, The Death and Life of the Great American Cities, the first part has, I think, 6 or 7 chapters, and most of those chapters are about sidewalks, just sidewalks. And she just talks about the consequences of having good sidewalks and not having good sidewalks, and how that impacts walkability, how that impacts security and crime. and mixed use and all these things. It's so powerful. Trent, no wonder nobody's doing that walk down 10th Street that you took, right? It's unpleasant. And without the foot traffic, guess what? No one's going to put a business there. Right? Businesses need foot traffic too. So there's all these consequences. And when I talk to my daughters living in an urban environment, I used to live in an area called Bishop Arts. That's kind of a gentrified area southwest of Dallas. And I would let the girls walk around by themselves, but I would tell them there are two things you're always looking for. One, light. You want there to be light. And two, eyes, people with eyes. Mm-hmm. And I learned that from Jane Jacobs. Like good lighting and good and eyes on the street deters 95% of the crime. Because what are people mostly looking for? Opportunities. And so I think that what we've done with a lot of our designs is we've actually an unintended consequence is created a better environment for crime to exist. And that's where I think these conversations are so powerful. And if I can read a quote from an academic paper that I read called Jane Jacobs' Critique of Rationalism in Urban Planning, like you said, but it said, we might well then call Jane Jacobs an urban physician. I love that line, an urban physician. Instead of an urban planner trying to bulldoze and build a utopia, it's like, how do we bring health to what already exists? So I'm just curious, why do these questions matter that we're talking about, Trent?
Yeah. They matter because when I think of, you and I have talked before about like aesthetics, like when somebody says, oh, it's not pleasing to me aesthetically. It's when you say that, you almost feel like it's sort of icing on the cake. But as you said, aesthetics impinges upon our being as humans. If we live in ugly places, we become ugly people, I believe. If we live in beautiful places, we can become beautiful people. Or we might say that beautiful, we create the beauty that surrounds us. And obviously that's a generalization. But I think that the places where we live say a lot of things about what kind of world we're trying to build. And I think we have dignity and great beauty as human beings. We ought to create beautiful places. I wanted to say this, we go, you just went and I've gone to other cities in the US and in particular cities in Europe and other parts of the world. We go on these vacations in some ways because of the dearth of those kinds of experiences. It's just so amazing. We save up this money and take time. And listen, I'm going to keep doing it.
Yeah,
but we do it because there's a hunger to be. Look, we can. I can go out, and I have gone out fairly recently to the mountains. That raw wilderness experience is fantastic. It's necessary. It's good. Being in a city environment that is full of concrete and wood and brick and the sound of bulldozers and jackhammers. Okay, that's a different kind of experience, but there's something life-giving about being in a city that's full of people of all shapes and sizes and backgrounds interacting in a very exciting way and seeing what's happening as people get together and come up with new ideas. And cities are the great places of discovery and innovation and invention and struggle and social movements and all these kinds of things. And so I think that these are more and more people are living in cities. And I think you've got statistics for that maybe 80% of people in the United States are living in cities. And so we better fucking get it right or start getting it right, because it really does matter for more than just aesthetic reasons. That the way we shape our cities has a huge impact on what we can do as a people, as we've already cited instances from the architecture of a sidewalk to the placement of buildings and the actual math of how far away it is from other things. I mean, these things are of in some instances matters of life and death when it comes to crime.
Yeah,
so that's why I think I'm interested in these things. And then I'll say one more thing. Like, I live right now in a house that's next to a park. I'm looking at it right now. It's a beautiful park, Addenbrooke Park, beautiful place. I don't have a lot of reasons to complain. I live in a pretty good place, but there's that hunger in me in our neighborhood's doing some things. Like, about 4 blocks away, we have coffee shop. We have a little burrito restaurant. There's a little Asian restaurant. There's a 7-Eleven. There's going to be a smoke shop pretty soon. So there's some stuff that's nearby, which I'm very excited about, because it's making this neighborhood reasonably walkable. It's otherwise not a great walkable neighborhood, because I can't go get groceries. I can't do a lot of things, go get clothing and those kinds of things. But there are more and more things that I can walk to. I'm pretty sure that people the world over want to walk to places. And when you walk places, how many times have you been walking somewhere and you meet some new person, or you see an old friend, or you see something in a neighborhood that you hadn't ever seen before? Getting out and being on your feet is such a you've driven through places before, and then you walk those same places and you're like, I've never seen this place before. I've never seen this place. I didn't see the shade of red on the shutters or the front door of that house. I never saw it before. I never smelled the garlic coming out of that house as someone's cooking or whatever. You do not experience something unless you get off your feet and get out of your fucking car, which is going to be the subject of another episode. Yeah. So.
Yeah, and on that point, one of the things that's so difficult here in America is most of the cities, apart from New York City and Chicago, and kind of DC, kind of LA, but mostly those two, everything else has been designed around the car. That's why when you go to Europe, all these cities came into being before the advent of the car. So they have to deal with the walkability. That is just baked into it. If you have a car, it's hard to get around some of these cities because it's just the streets are too narrow and they're cobblestone or whatever it may be. So we have that going against us here in America in terms of that. I think we are hungry for that walkability. Like my neighborhood, let me just share a little bit about my neighborhood. Me and my wife bought this house. We tried to get as close to, there's a lake here in East Dallas called White Rock Lake. We love that amenity. It's a man-made lake, but it's a good amenity here for Dallas. It's one of the nicest things here in Dallas, in my opinion. And we're like, let's get as close to that as we can afford. We could not afford to get super close. We're maybe a mile away from it, and we're in a neighborhood that has a lot of these houses that are being renovated, and so we bought in this dumb housing market, and we bought this, paid for more than it was probably needs to be worth, but. We live in a neighborhood that has sometimes people are like, oh, you kind of live in the hood. And I'm like, no, when people say that, what they really mean is like, oh, you don't live in this cookie cutter suburban neighborhood where nobody talks to each other and everyone is so isolated, and you have gigantic neighborhoods, and you have to, you can drive 2 miles to some shopping center where all your stuff is. But basically, the way suburbs are all designed is to create these very individualistic homes where people can invite people to their homes, but they don't know anyone who lives next to them.
Yeah.
I know my neighbors. I walk around. When we walk our dog, we run into 10 or 12 people. And my next door neighbors, when first I got to know them, that house is a rental, and it's I think it's the family is living there is Hispanic, and they're lower income, and I got to know the husband there, call him Big Boy, and one of the first things that he has a tattoo on the side of his head it says Dallas Cowboys. So when he shaves his head in the summers, you can see that, and I happen to have a football that was signed by Dak Prescott. And I'm not super sentimental about those things, but I was holding on to it. And I was like, man, I'm going to give that to Big Boy. I think he would love that. And he did. He loved it. But you know what I got? I got like a free security guard for my home. And whenever we're out of
Yes.
town, I just text Big Boy and I'm like, "Hey man, can you feed our cat Trixie?" He said, "Man, I got you, brother." And they'll have quinceañeras or birthday parties or a cookout next door. We'll go over and eat some of the grill, and we just hang out. We hand back and forth food, and this is those kinds of things that that happen more naturally in certain kinds of environments where the yards aren't gigantic and the houses aren't so far apart, or people aren't parking in garages, so they're never actually outside and see anyone. So there's all these kinds of things that have impact on our quality of life, and that's what I think about what you're kind of talking about there. So let's close out here, my friend. The statistics that you kind of mentioned is most recent data says that across the world, 56% of people live in cities. And these are big cities. So that's already a pretty high number. But here in the States, it's 80. And which is so weird because, the politics are cities tend to be more progressive. Rural tends to be more conservative. But because the way we do voting and everything, like electoral votes and all those kinds of things in the counties and whatnot, these very underpopulated counties have a higher kind of impact on things. But here in America, cities are just extraordinarily important. And what I'd like to ask you is, in your opinion, why does this conversation about cities in America matter rather than people just going with the flow of modern foolishness? How might people better contribute to a world that improves the lives of as many people as possible? Because I think that's what this conversation is. How can we be generous instead of only being concerned about what impacts Joel? How can I think and use my imagination in a way that helps other people, that helps as many people as possible by creating environments where the quality of life just naturally increases?
Boy, I mean, I don't have the answer for that, Joel. I mean, I think that what we're doing is the kind of thing that I think if more people were doing it, it would be better. The kind of city that, so I want things for myself. Okay, that's part of the survival project of being a human being. But I know too that I'm more likely to get good things for myself if other people are getting good things for themselves as well. That's the magic in some ways of being a human being, is that we've evolved we've all evolved such capacities to be able to look out for each other in a way that does not diminish ourselves. I think that's the challenge, is how can we create cities that are organisms that serve all of the constituent parts really well. And so I think I'd say this one thing, Joel, that everyone's so glued in, obviously, into presidential politics right now. I am trying as much as I can to check out of that, and one of the reasons is, to me, trying to feel like you're having an impact on presidential politics is trying to bench press the moon. There's just not enough leverage as a human being. Now, what's exciting though is what's happening locally in our communities. We can have more of an impact there. And we are stakeholders in these places that we're actually going to live in. And I think one of the lessons from Jane Jacobs, sorry, that's my phone with notes. One of the lessons from Jane Jacobs is, don't wait until you're a specialist. You have a right to be involved in these conversations. One of the ways that you have to do, and Joel and I are trying to embody that in some ways, because we're curious people. But I would say, as a practical matter to people, as I've mentioned, I've hammered on this theme so many times, but you're not going to have time, America, you're not going to have time to have these discussions, to do research, to allow your curiosity to bake some, if you're working 60-hour weeks nonstop for God knows whatever reason. Don't think you're going to have any time. You're going to, if you care about these things and you're not going to go crazy because you're trying to carve out time you don't have, you might have to. Now, everyone's got schedules, I understand, but you might have to carve out some time, some margin to where your mind can drift to these things. And these are, imagine if more and more people were having these kinds of informal discussions with each other, and then those conversations were spilling out into neighborhood groups or to book clubs or to associations that you're part of at church or civic organizations. That's where shit happens, man. When people in cities are like, you know, I feel a stake with what's happening in my neighborhood. I don't know how I'm going to get involved, but like, I care about some of the things that are happening because they could make this place even better. And so that's what I'd say, Joel. That'd be my 2 cents on the topic. What about you?
Yeah, I like that, getting involved, engaged locally. Unfortunately, I feel like we live in a country that, have you heard of the term NIMBY politics?
Not in my backyard.
Not in my backyard. Yeah. And that is the kind of thinking that Jane Jacobs was really against. It's because it's so small-minded. If we only are concerned with our backyard and our perceived threats, oh man, I don't want like a homeless shelter wherever, you know, that's going to bring all of these, you know, crime and whatnot. It's actually just really like small thinking. Do some study. Look at places where this has happened and see how actually some of these things can bring an increase in safety, or it can bring can alleviate some of the social ills and increase more opportunity for cool things to happen. So my main thing is to love where you live. I love that line. Love where you live. If you don't love where you live, move and find somewhere you can love. Love where you live, because it does us no good by pointing at the grass on the other side of the hill. It's just water the grass you're on and see what change you can make by doing that. Any final words from you, my friend?
Man, I think we've covered some good ground. I don't think I'd have anything else to say. I think it's been a fun discussion, one that warrants. I mean, I think we're just at the tip of the iceberg, and so there's so many other things that we could go into and probably will go into. But it's such an exciting topic, and it's sort of a launch pad for so many other topics, because cities are these great nexus of people and culture and ideas and design. There's just so much that happens inside cities, and so it's a locus for a lot of great conversations.
I love that. Yeah, thanks for your insight, Trent, joining me as a uncredentialed non-expert on this topic. Hopefully we gave some interesting thoughts for people to consider. Everyone, thanks for joining us for this episode of Lead Balloons, the Alchemy of Unpopular Opinions. My name is Joel, signing off.